Welcome to Beerstories from Beerstories Brewhouse. I made an interview with Moersleutel talking about, inspired by these two beers. In the interview we talk about how they brew them, brewing techniques and stuff like that. This is part 2. Part 1 was everything happening during the brewing. Part 2 is everything happening in the cellar, fermentation, barrel aging and stuff like that. And then there's also part 3, which is all the questions from the viewers. But stay tuned for the cellaring. Okay, so we should be live now. I'm sitting in my beer cave, and with me is Jorge and Rowan from Moersleutel, and we're going to talk about stouts. So yeah, let's kick it. Okay, so moving on to fermentation. How are you cooling the wort down? Is that a plate chiller or?
It's a pretty big plate chiller. Usually we needed like 30 minutes, between 30 minutes and an hour to get the whole kettle into the fermenter.
Okay. How many liters is one kettle?
2,500. So 25 liters.
Yeah.
We can bump it up to almost 30. But usually it's we calculate everything based on 25, 26 hectoliters.
Yeah. Cool. And then are you oxygenating it when it arrives in the fermentation tank, or what are you doing then?
It's in line after the heat exchanger. So there's a carbonation stone after the heat exchanger. So when the wort is cooled down, we can pretty easily control the amount of oxygen that's going in.
Yeah.
We done measurements. We have a portable oxygen meter. And usually it's what we expect it to be. So that's quite nice.
Yeah, because I know when I brew big stouts, I guess when everyone brew big stouts, the most important thing is probably yeast health, right?
Yeah, yeah. If your yeast is not happy, you are not gonna be happy at the end.
No. So what are you doing to keep your yeast happy?
We do quite some oxygenation. It's actually funny. We do more oxygen for the IPAs, I would say, because the yeast is just more hungry for oxygen. We do like 3 grams a liter, right, George?
3 liters per minute, which counts for about 20-some ppm, which is very on the high end. So I think we actually do the same rate for IPAs and stouts. The thing is, proportionally, it's lower for stouts, given the amount of initial sugar content you're aiming for. But I think if you aim for the grand rule of 1 ppm of oxygen per degree Plato, you should be fine. So we do 20 to 24 in stouts and the same for IPAs, but that's because English strains that ferment New England style IPAs, they're very savvy for oxygen, so we need to go extra oxygen. But I think Rowan wants to really talk about our propagation system that I very much
yeah. Oh, you set me up there. There we go.
Yeah, I know.
That's a trap we can talk about. Yeah, it's since a couple. I think it's been like 6 months now. We have a proper propagator. So that's a 700 liter vessel that has a spinner in the middle that can make sure that everything is homogeneous all the time. We have a automatic oxygenation system, meaning that there is a pulse going every 5 minutes with oxygen. So we can go for maximum yeast growth. instead of the fermentation. So yeast has two different pathways it can take. It's either cell growth or fermentation. And by giving it a constant stream of oxygen, you will push it into the growth phase. This, practically speaking, that means that we can turn one yeast cell into if we do homebrew packs, we can turn 5 into 20 within 24 hours, and those 20 will go to 100 in 48 hours.
Yeah.
So it's like we can get away with a lot now with the healthy yeast we get. Let's see. Usually, it gets 4 times growth within 24 hours, and then even more 48. So what we have been doing is we do a propagation of a certain yeast, whatever we want. We pull a part out of the propagator, and in the same cast of wort going to the fermenter, we push wort back into the propagator. So you start a second propagation for the next batch.
Yeah.
So we've been planning beers now that 1 week has the same yeast, and then the week after has the same yeast.
Okay.
So we go as efficiently as possible with the yeast we have.
Yeah. So you're not just using one yeast. You don't have a house yeast. You're changing them up all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. For now, we've been doing a lot of playing around, but before that, we did a lot of dry and direct pitches. So this is like a breath of new air. Let's say. So,
what yeast is in motor oil? Is that an SO4 or is it what's that?
USO5. That's the American strain.
Okay. Yeah. Is that the same in the blue code, the blue barcode?
I guess so, but that's a bit hard to say because the barrel-aged beers are always a blend of certain barrels, and we don't really put beer on barrels with a certain idea in mind. We give the barrel master the freedom to blend certain flavors together, do trials to see what is the best blend. Mm-hmm. So it might be that there are actually 3 or 4 different. No, it's not, but in the future it can be.
Okay. Okay.
But there's actually multiple different ones in there.
Yeah. So what about so now we oxygenated the wort, we added yeast, so now it's practically beer. Are you recirculating in the tank, or is it just leaving it there, or what's your fermentation like?
So we oxygenate throughout the whole cast of the beer, so putting it in the fermenter. So the oxygen is already everywhere, and the yeast is liquid, and we push it from the propagator into after at the same moment as the oxygen actually. Yeah. So it's all in line. We put the yeast in line as well. So the yeast and oxygen are everywhere in the tank already from the get-go.
Yeah. So you don't recirculate anything?
No, not needed.
Okay. How long are you fermenting for? How long time does it ferment?
Motor oil is usually like 10 to 12 days, but we have done imperial stouts as fast as a bit more than a week.
Yeah.
So like 7-8 days.
Is that active fermentation or is it with a VDK rest?
We usually don't do a VDK rest. Yeah, we do. We don't do a test. We do a rest. So we go up in temperature.
Yeah, okay.
So we get it to...
When are you ramping the temperature up? Is that when you are just about hitting your final gravity, then you ramp up the temperature, or how?
It depends a little bit on the beer. If you want to, if it's a yeast strain that throws a lot of esters, we want to make, and we don't really want the esters, we keep the cold phase a bit longer, just to be sure that it doesn't make too much esters.
Yeah.
Because it's a very stressful environment, those beers. It's usually like 30 Plato or more. So if you go too warm in the beginning, your yeast will just start to die at some point. And
yeah. And it would also, what's your opinion about, because in my experience, if you have, if you're making a strong stout or strong beer, if you start fermenting at a high temperature, you will get more boozy notes in the end. If you start low and then ramp it up just slowly, you'll get a more, just a fuller beer and no booziness. What's your experience with that?
So yeast usually makes the esters in the first 3 days of fermentation. So that's why we always keep the beer at a certain temperature for 3 days. And then depending on how sure we want to make that the esters don't go out of hand, we let it go.
Yeah.
It's like a saison kind of thing. At some point, you start low and you just let it free rise to 24, 26.
Okay, so you're not cooling it down at all? You're just letting it free rise?
We hold it at first temperature, so that's usually either 19 or 21. It depends a lot on what yeast you're using.
Yeah.
It can be 15. So primary fermentation temperature. And after 3 or 4 days, we let the cooling off, and it will rise on its own to 24 or 25. And then we cap it again, because you don't want to go higher, because the yeast will kill itself.
Okay, awesome. So what about the VDK rest? You say you're not concerned about that, or you're not concerned about off flavors in that way? Is that because you have so much control over the initial fermentation, or because usually my rule of thumb is if you have an active fermentation in 5 days, you have to give it 5 days for a VDK rest.
We give it a VDK rest as long as the beer needs to get stable.
Okay.
So we just let it. So let's say we have imperial stout that starts at 19 C. After 3 days, we let it go to 25 or 24, and then we just keep it at that temperature until the final gravity is stable, and then we crash it. And in our beers, you will not, if there is any diacetyl left, you will not taste it because there's so much going on.
Yeah, you're probably right. What's your
in IPAs, you have to be more careful. But
yeah, okay. So in stouts, it's not that big of a deal. In IPAs or other beers, it's more of a big deal.
Yeah, we have done a couple of West Coast IPAs that we thought, this needs a little bit longer warm.
Yeah, okay. So you're just tasting every day to see when it's ready?
When we do alcohol measurements, we have Anton Paar. Yeah, it's an LX500, but it's like an alkalizer, so you can very precisely measure the gravity and the alcohol.
Okay.
Meaning that we can very precisely say when the beer is stable, when it's done.
Yeah.
And then we just cold crash it and go from there.
Okay. So what's your take or what's your opinion on adding muscovado sugar or any other sugars in the fermentation? Are you doing that?
I want to do this one, George. You've been silent for a bit. I'm sorry. I got on your rant on yeast. It's just you set me up, and there I go.
Yeah, I know. It was a trap. I was setting you up for a trap. No, I took some time to get some answers out at the
that's
YouTube,
awesome.
So I was just entertained by listening to you. No, I mean the sugar addition. We do use sugars. There's no point of not saying we don't use sugars. I mean, we brew these 30 to 40 Plato beers, so we obviously I end up using some sugars. We try to use mostly maltose syrups whenever we got to refer to those. But we also see sugar as an ingredient. That's fun because most breweries would just look at sugar as a way to get to a mean to get to an end. But we've used a different range of sugars. We've used muscovado, for example, to impart some more of the caramel flavors. We've used Belgian candy syrup just recently to brew a Belgium-inspired stout. We use maltodextrin to get some thicker backbone. We don't use any lactose. That's something we've stopped doing over a year ago.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's just a philosophical standpoint on a sustainable aspect, and also because of sustainable on the beer itself. We've seen some of the beers, they don't age as well when they have lactose in it, so we just stopped using completely.
Okay.
Because we like our beers to age better as fast as possible. Muscovado we've used a few times. We've used some other darker molasses style sugars. But we use them during fermentation if needed. We use them during boil if needed. We've used them after the beer is actually done and right about to be packaged. So we don't pasteurize any of our beers, but you've got other means to stabilize. And most of all, we also centrifuge our beers so they're free of yeast and particles. So we get some, we can ensure some stability on the product. And we've added some post-fermentation sugars as well to better capture the flavor. Because if you add the sugar during fermentation, I recall we did maple syrup once, and we did like 10 or 15% of the whole recipe was maple syrup, something that was just from a financial standpoint just not reasonable. And the beer had no maple flavor, even though it was like 15% in there. So we have then used some maple syrup post fermentation to capture better the flavor of maple syrup. So it really depends on what you're trying to get again.
Okay, so you actually have tried to back sweeten with maple syrup because you centrifuge and all the yeast is gone, so you can actually back sweeten it. Okay, yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You can also freeze distill a beer like we've done in some of these beers.
Yeah.
I guess we can leave that freeze distillation process for a second opportunity, but it's something that we also do around here to concentrate the alcohol content that also creates stability in your products.
That's a huge amount of beer to freeze distillate.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what about pH in your? Are you worried about the pH going into the fermenter?
As a checking mechanism, yes. It's checking if the batches are reliable, I would say.
Okay. So it's just
not so much on the pH before fermentation. We have dialed in the pH pretty well right now.
Yes, so we've tried to adjust that. So there's a lot of brewers that tend to brew by numbers and not a reference to the brewery, just actually brew by a technical standpoint where you read that your post-boil pH should be comprised between 4.9 and 5.1 pH. And they go to the extent of adding extra minerals to it to just make sure their wort is within the guidelines. We've tried that, but since we run this direct fire kettle, our pH is usually on the lower end at 4.7 to 4.8 post-boil because it just caramelizes a lot and brings a lot of the, caramel as low pH, brings out some of these acidic compounds that bring down the pH. Back in the past, we tried to adjust that to, play by the book and make sure we were within standards. But more and more, we're trying to just let the beer talk itself and make these decisions flavor-driven.
Okay.
And not as much data-driven. So we tend to just let the pH, if it is 4.6, sometimes happens, going into the FB, we just let it be. And usually the final pH in a beer, and Rowan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, the finishing pH in beer is not related to the starting pH before fermentation. So it doesn't mean if you start low first out, like 4.6, 4.7 sounds super low because your finishing pH should be between 4.2 and 4.5.
Yeah.
So 4.6, 4.7 sounds to be super low, but what we see, it's they're not correlated most of the times.
Okay, so where are you ending up? Are you ending up at around those 4.2 or 4.5 or what?
Really depends on the beer and the yeast. I would say mostly depends on the yeast and if you're doing any dry ups.
Yeah.
But yeah, usually we get our imperial stouts between 4.4 and 4.6.
Okay.
That's normal. We are not worried that if it is lower, we will probably look into the process if something happened. And the same if it's higher. Like, did we use any adjuncts that increase the pH significantly? We have seen some beers that go as high that you almost get uncomfortable, but not really, because there's so much alcohol. It should be fine.
Yeah. Okay, so you're not adjusting the final pH. You're just taking a measurement to see if it's actually just in the ballpark, or you hit your target number and you don't adjust it.
Depends.
And if there's something wrong, you will take a look at the process instead.
No, we look at the flavor first and then check the pH. If the pH matches the flavor. So usually if you have a lower pH, you will get some more, in stouts, roasty notes, some more sharp notes. And if you get the pH higher, it will be more round. Sometimes chalky. So that's a thing to watch out for. But if the flavor lacks something, pH is usually one of the things we look at to tweak. But we don't do a lot of that in stouts, though.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, basically that was we went through the motor oil. Let's talk a little bit about the barcode, because that's a barrel aged beer. And what are your thoughts on barrel aging in general? Because again, just like the imperial stouts, I think you're one of the best breweries in Europe to barrel age beers. So how do you select the barrels, and what's your philosophy behind the barrel aging?
So, shall I take this one, George, or do you want to take this one?
No, I'll go this one in memory of our dear colleague Michiel. So Michiel is our barrel manager. He takes great care of the barrels. It's funny because it kind of sells a line between regular beers and barrel aged beers, but we share the same principle of deciding beers by flavor. So while most other breweries, they just decide they have this brand that should go well into a barrel. They just make the same beer, put it in a barrel, and magically hope that something nice comes out of it. But we've seen that it doesn't work that way. So the beers you brew to have barrel aged, they're not necessarily the same beers you brew to have regularly. So we often don't do motor oil barrel aged, for example. It's something that we just don't do anymore. So our current approach with most of the barrel aged stouts, we just get a base stout brewed, and by base I mean 40 Plato, between 35 and 40 Plato, so a bit higher than the regular beers. There we use some unfermentable sugars to make sure they withstand enough body to go over the aging process, which we've seen that tends to drive away some body and some depth from these beers, so they need to be really thick and creamy going in. It's quite fun because most beers that go into barrel aging are borderline drinkable, as in they don't really taste good, but when they came out, they're insane. So that's kind of the funny thing about barrel aged beers. But we just make that beer usually also more bitter, a bit more roast malt, so just everything but more to achieve that intensity. But we don't have a goal in our sight. So we don't make a recipe saying we're going to use marshmallows. We don't make a beer saying we're going to use coconut. We have the barrels and we can make a wort that fits those barrels. So let's say you have a port wine, for example. Port wine carries a lot of these cherry notes to it and some acidity. So for those recipes, maybe we get some more dried fruit, like specialty malts that will, and dark roast caramel malts that will enhance those prune plum-like flavors that will pair well with the cherry notes from the port barrel. If we have some bourbons, maybe we go for a plain base where we just focus on a lot of caramels to capture a lot of that coconut vanilla you get from bourbons, and so on, so on, so on. So we try to have a palette of elements in our barrel warehouse. We keep about 260 barrels these days, so it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot of space to manage, and quite a lot of barrels to taste as well, which is good, but takes a lot of work. So Michiel just goes around every other week with a tasting set. So we try to so we have a schedule, a pretty elaborate one, that after 6 months we start testing out the barrels. Usually less is better for barrel aged Scotch, so, or for barrel aged beers in general. When you see 3 years, I tend to frown upon. I think the sweet spot's about 1 year old barrels, because you still have beer flavor and some of the barrel flavor in there. But Michiel just goes around collecting tasting notes on those barrels, and we try to rate them, see which ones are aging and performing better, and then depending on the necessity of projects, we'll assemble some of these beers. Some others get picked for the indulgence for our guild membership club that every 2 months has a exclusive release of a barrel aged beer. No adjuncts, just a pure stout and barrel. But it's a lot of work trying to figure out how these pieces fit together to make the puzzle. For example, if I tell you that in a session we have 6 beers, 3 beers clearly stand out. They're the best out of the 6 individually. And any sane person would think that the 3 best, when combined together, would make it even better. That's just logical reasoning. But the funny thing is, if you mix up the 3 best barrels that we have on that session, does not always mean that it's a better beer. We've seen cases where the combination of 3 great beers turn out to be a bad beer. I'm not sure how this is possible, but that's why we have to make these decisions flavor driven and not necessarily just randomly pick them. So sometimes the not so good barrels on their own, they will impart some flavor ranges to the best beer we have, and when combined, you get something amazing. So great props to Michiel. I'm not sure if he's around, but he's doing a lot of this boring work to find the right combinations to make it really work out. The same with adjuncts, and after we have the base blend, we make a sample and analyze if and what adjuncts are suitable to the beer.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. So basically you're, yeah, I heard that before. If you're gonna barrel age, you need a thicker beer. So yeah, and then you're actually dialing in your recipe for each barrel. Yeah, I think that's awesome. What about? Are you worried about oxygen and infections in your barrels, or are your stouts that they're high in ABV? So are they not taking any infections in, or how are you treating your barrels?
So usually we get our barrels pretty fresh, meaning that they still have liquor in them, meaning that they still should be sterile. So sometimes we roll them around to get the liquor everywhere, but usually our beers will also take care of it. And oxygen, yeah, we are quite concerned about it, because if you put a imperial stout on barrels and you keep the headspace in the barrel like this, you will end up with soy sauce.
Okay.
That's the oxidation effect of on imperial stouts. Usually gets soy. So Michiel tops them off several times He does the first round, and fermentation makes CO2, so you usually have a bit of foam on top, which will collapse over time. So he puts an airlock on it and then puts a little bit more beer in there, just to make sure there's no oxygen in the headspace. But the micro-oxygenation by the wood, we are not concerned about. That's so little that it's usually the right amount we want to have, because it also contributes to the beer complexity at the end.
Yeah, exactly. It's part of the flavor, part of the barrel aging. Yeah. So what about temperature? Do you keep the barrels in a cool storage facility, or is it just in the warehouse, or how?
It's in the warehouse, so it's open to the changes of season. But it actually helps the barrel aging process, I would say, because wood expands and contracts when it gets warmer and colder, meaning that you get a faster interaction between the wood and the beer.
Okay.
So I think you should not keep your barrel in a climate controlled room, because it will just slow down your aging.
Okay.
Do you agree, George? That's
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you have in a climate controlled room, you can actually control your climate, so you can simulate the seasons. But I do agree that the seasonal rotation helps with barrels. I think Netherlands being a naturally off cold country actually helps. Back my days in Portugal, you'd see a much faster aging because the weather was just warmer. So aging at 30 degrees Celsius will just accelerate the reactions. So if you're able to go a little bit colder and some changes, you can better find the peak point of taste each of your barrels.
Cool. Do you have any favorite barrels? Any favorite companies you get barrels from?
Well, companies exactly, I'm not sure who we work with. That's more on Michiel's field of expertise. I would say that bourbons are just a natural fit for stouts.
Yeah.
They're just a natural fit. I mean, I really like rum, but that's because that's maybe the only spirit that I actually care for. Okay. So if I have to drink a spirit, that's the only one, or a spirit neat with nothing added. It's the one that I enjoy the most. I'm not much of a whiskey or bourbon guy, but I think in stouts they can be pretty nice if they're worked well nicely. Like the beer you have there, the Barcode Blue, Platinum and Blue. It's a bourbon and rum barrel age. But I'd say bourbon, it's just a perfect fit for stouts.
Yeah, it seems to be a popular choice. Yeah, cool. So
I quite like the tequila as well, though. It's like it gives a punch. Tequila is like pure. When it gets back into the beer, it's like a booze punch, which can really help the balance in a beer sometimes. But
yeah,
it's from bourbon, tequila.
Yeah. So what about so now we got the beer in the barrel and it's done. So it's time for getting it in cans or bottles. What's the process there? Is it going back into a tank to carbonate, or what are you doing? And what are you measuring? Are you measuring pH again, or is it just going on bottles?
Yeah, so usually Michiel does trials first before we put something back in a tank. So we trials what barrels needs to get into the tank, and then we get them in the bright beer tank. We send a sample to the lab because we care a lot about not exploding our cans or bottles. Usually, I think on barrel aged beers we never had a contamination, but it's something to keep in mind and always check, because the problem can be in a very small corner, I would say. So we get it into the bright beer tank. We carbonate it and then we taste it from the tank. And then we decide if it needs something else.
Okay.
Can be a mineral addition, can be acid, can be like the beer you are about to taste. I don't know if you cracked it yet, but
No.
the barcode, I think we thought it needed some spice, some nuttiness, maybe towards cinnamon, and that's exactly what Tonka will provide. Because that's the one with Tonka, right? The Tonka rum and bourbon. Yeah.
Okay,
so then we decide.
So you actually add some adjuncts right there after the barrel aging in the bright tank?
If needed, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
The adjuncts are always post barrel aging and not before barrel aging.
Oh, yeah.
Otherwise it gets, any oxygen will hurt adjuncts even more than the beer, so.
That was the end of part 2, all about the cellaring. Everything that happens in the cellar. If you want to watch part 1, you can do that up here. Part 2, you can see that right here. Part 2 is all the questions that the viewers had. Part 1 is all the brewing process and everything. So yeah, pick one of those and check that out. Thanks for watching.